started. So thank you everyone for joining us today for our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion focused seminar series. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge that my place of research is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Coast Swahish peoples, including the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. My name is Hale Kincross. I'm a PhD student in the Genome Sciences Center and a member of the Diversity Matters Council. We are a group of passionate individuals who are committed to advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion in research and healthcare. If you enjoy this talk, please consider contacting us to help with future events, uplifting voices, and advocating for better and more inclusive, equitable, and diverse research. So it is my honor and pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Lisa Willis. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Alberta. Her interests lie in understanding how glycans control the immune response, and particularly how they differ in males and females. She's also the founder of InclusiveSTEM, a literature-based, data-driven, solutions-focused framework for improving the participation and lived experiences of marginalized groups in STEM. So in this talk, Dr. Willis will discuss strategies to reduce bias and discrimination in STEM. So, and with that, it's my honor to introduce and allow Dr. Willis to take us away.
Thank you very much, Hale. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to chatting with everyone today. I'm just going to start by talking about that land acknowledgement, putting up the land acknowledgement from the University of Alberta, and just mentioning that the land acknowledgement is meant to be a starting point for truth and reconciliation. It's the land acknowledgement in and of itself is not the task. It is a reminder that we all have an obligation to truth and reconciliation. And sometimes people don't really think about what that term means, truth and reconciliation. So those are two different things. Truth is about learning what happened, how it is affecting what is still happening. It's about unlearning things that we learned, especially those of us who have been in Canada for a longer period of time, have been exposed to a lot of propaganda in the forms of politics and movies and things like that. So unlearning things that we learned that may not accurately reflect what happened and what is currently happening, and then re-educating ourselves. So that's the truth part. And then reconciliation is about action. What actions do you take? Are you donating to Indigenous causes? Are you trying to amplify Indigenous voices? That kind of thing. So I think it's really important when we talk about land acknowledgements to remember what they are intended to start. Okay, so today we are talking about how we address bias and discrimination in STEM. I really hope that this is an opportunity for people to engage. Everything that I'm talking about comes from what does the literature say is the problem, what does the literature say is good solutions. So it's a great opportunity for us to have a conversation about what we can all do. It's meant to be really inclusive. If you maybe don't know what the right words are, you don't know how to ask your question. Like for me, any question that comes from a place of genuinely trying to understand, genuinely trying to move forward on this journey that is each one of us is on and is so individual. Any question that comes from that place of trying to engage is good, I think, and I welcome them. I will also say that I am more than happy to share this presentation. I'm not going to go through every point on all the slides. It's meant to be a resource. So if you are interested in what's on the slides, you can take photos, you can hit print screen, or you can just email me afterwards, and my email will be on the last slide, and just ask for them. I'm happy to share. Also want to give a shout out to the Health Promotion Initiative Fund, which was used to help fund this today. Okay, so I just want to start off putting us all on the same page with regards to what EDI actually is in Canada. So EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Equity is about providing people what they need to succeed, creating systems where people in all of their individuality can succeed. So it's not the same thing as equality. Equality is about treating everyone the same. It doesn't recognize that people have different starting places and different needs. I always use the analogy, and I always say that I always use the analogy, that equality, if you think about running a race, equality is about giving everyone the same size shoe, regardless of how big their foot is. We know that that doesn't make any sense intuitively. Equity is about recognizing that people have different sized feet, they need different shoes in order to run their best race. And that's really what we want. We want people excelling to the best of their ability. Diversity is about recognizing and valuing people's differences. I have the definition from the Canadian government here. It's an umbrella term that encompasses everything that we're talking about in public discourse with regards to people's differences, race, ethnicity, etc. And then inclusion is making sure everybody has the opportunity to participate fully and authentically in a meaningful way. It's not the same thing as making sure everyone participates, but that we are offering them opportunity to participate in ways that doesn't discriminate against them, in ways that makes them feel good about themselves and the community. Racialization, this is a new term that's replaced visible minority and person of color. It is the process by which we, as members of society, construct races as real, different, and unequal in ways that matter. Sometimes some of you might have heard the term BIPOC. It's more of an American term. Racialization is the term that we use in Canada. And then we have sex and gender. So sex is your biology, your phenotypes. It is not binary. Right? Binary is 0 and 1, that they are distinct, they are non-overlapping. That's what binary is. And sex is not binary. There's lots of heterogeneity within the sexes and overlap between the sexes. So even though we refer to it sometimes as male-female, it's not binary. And then we have gender, and gender is who you see yourself to be in the context of society. It's how society views you, society's expectations of your behavior. That's gender. And gender and sex interact, they influence one another, right? Your hormones, your chromosomes, they affect your secondary sex characteristics, and gender, lived experiences absolutely affect biology. And particularly biology with regards to sex. So they are separate, but overlapping, integrated, maybe should be integrated. Okay, so I like to start off with why EDI is important. Probably because you're here, you agree with me that EDI is an important consideration, but it's nice sometimes to articulate it, because sometimes we have to articulate it to other people who maybe aren't on the same page as we are. So I always like to talk about this. Obviously, one of the biggest reasons is morality, right? I think that discrimination for things that people can't control, like the color of their skin, is morally reprehensible, but that's me. Other people have different value systems. There's also this idea that science affects everyone. And so everyone should have a voice in what science gets done and how it gets done. Also, science is paid for by the taxpayers. The vast majority of science is paid for by the taxpayers in Canada. And so it should both reflect and serve that demographic. If you take a second and just think about Canadian, picture a Canadian in your mind, what does that Canadian look like? Is it an archetype? Is it a white male? Is it a reflection of our politicians right now? Most of our politicians? Or does it reflect all of the incredible rich diversity that actually is represented by people who call themselves Canadian? We also know that EDI is important for better team science. and full utilization of human capital. When you meaningfully incorporate EDI into research and really any team-based activity, you get better outcomes. We know that diversity drives innovation. There's so much data that describes how diversity is actually beneficial. Some people talk about, well, we have to lower the bar. The diversity hire is not as good as somebody who we would have hired if we didn't have to consider diversity. But actually, diversity makes all of us better. It's a good thing. It's actually a recognition of what excellence is and a departure from what we used to consider excellent. So our ability to achieve things is based on, in my opinion, our inherent abilities, what our parents exposed to from a young age, what we were interested in as a child, maybe what our older siblings did. There's a lot of luck that goes into this, minus what I call the opportunity gap. And what goes into the opportunity gap are socioeconomic background. We know that people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds have access to fewer opportunities. Overt discrimination, this is where one person acts on the idea that they think that they are better than somebody else for reasons of race, sex, gender. So for me, bias is the internally held belief, and discrimination is the action upon that belief. So overt discrimination is acting on a belief that you are better than somebody else. And then unconscious bias. So unconscious bias is behavior that is shaped by implicit or unintended biases that come from repeated exposure to pervasive cultural stereotypes. So books, music, lyrics, movies, politics, the news, interpersonal interactions. We have a culture that does not value people from particular demographics as much as others. And ironically, people who value their objectivity, like scientists, are more likely to fall prey to these biases, partly because they are not paying attention to them. So there's two really important points here. This unconscious bias, you don't know that you have necessarily. If you've not really thought about it, you don't realize necessarily what they are. We don't realize what they are. I know what mine are because I spend a lot of time thinking about them. But these are beliefs that are held because of how we operate in society. So I'll give you an example. For me, one of my unconscious biases is actually about women. So even though I think that women are amazing and can be successful and can be leaders, when I am confronted with a woman in a leadership position, my knee-jerk reaction is to think, maybe she's not good enough. Maybe she's not deserving enough to be in that role. Maybe she's not going to be as successful in that role because society has told me so over and over and over again. It was really interesting. I just recently was listening to Gina Davis, the actress, talking about her role. She's got a role in a TV show where she's the president. And what she said was they did a survey after a single season of that show. And people were something like 30 to 60% more likely to vote for a female politician after seeing a woman in a presidential role. So these societal things that we see, they influence our actions. So coming back to this point, unconscious biases can be totally opposite to what you actually consciously value. I consciously value women, and yet my unconscious bias is biased against women. And it's only when I pay attention to my unconscious biases that I can make sure that my actions are more in line with my consciously held beliefs, as opposed to just my knee-jerk reaction. So the other really important thing on this slide, the second really important thing, is that regardless of whether or not I intend to discriminate, the outcome of my action is still discrimination. And in 2022, heading soon into 2023, 7-8 years after the Me Too movement, it's no longer okay to not recognize the impact of your actions. We need to be accountable for how we are behaving in society. So I think that that's really important. I'm going to show you a few statistics because I think interacting with data is really useful. The data that I'm going to show you is for women because we have really good data when it comes to women, females, in STEM in particular. So this data comes from the NSERC WISE report, which was released in 2017. We're really hoping that NSERC will update the report now that the 2021 census is complete. But this is the most recent data for all across Canada. And what we have here is a cohort of people who graduated high school in 2003 with a bachelor's degree in 2007 and so on. And the size of the bar is the number of people with men on the left and women on the right. Over here, we have the percentage of the total that is female. So 52% of people graduating from high school were female in 2003. Only 41% of people graduating with a bachelor's degree were female. That cohort, when they went to a master's degree, only 37% graduated, and then, or 37% were female, and then it's even lower for a PhD. So what you can see is that the longer you stay in academia, the less likely it is that you are female. And this is not just for academia. The same is true for industry, for government, etc. Women have experienced higher attrition than men. And what's really interesting, and one of the reasons that I think data is so important, is that it tells us whether or not we are actually doing things that are making the system better. Because when I was in undergrad, I thought that sexism was a thing of the past and that we just needed time for women to permeate up into the higher ranks. I thought that things were getting better. And it turns out that the numbers don't support that. So if you look at the percentage of people enrolling, this is enrolling at the top in a bachelor's degree, master's, doctoral degree, what percentage are women? Since like the mid 90s, it's been 38% in STEM fields across Canada, and that has not changed. Same with getting the degree. It's about the same. So people are not dropping out within the degree when it comes to women. They are just choosing not to pursue the next level up. The only place where we've seen any progress is in doctoral degrees. There was a bump in enrollment in the mid 90s, and then that cohort graduated in the mid 2000s. But aside from that, there's been no movement on these numbers. So we might think that things are getting better, but the data don't support that. And there's lots of data that does not support that. We know, because there's a huge body of literature, what bias and discrimination look like in STEM. Like any body of literature, there are really good studies and there are some less good studies. There's studies that show big differences. There's studies that show pretty small differences. But it really is a giant field. And for me, the one that really started it all, that looked at this issue of bias and discrimination in a really scientific way, particularly in the STEM fields, was this study from 2012. It's a very famous study. So I'm just going to go through it really quickly. What the authors did was to send out CVs to faculty across the US, faculty who are in chemistry, physics, biology. And these CVs were of an undergrad who had just finished their grad program. They wanted to go to grad school, but they were applying for a research manager position. And the professors were asked to rank these applicants' CVs in terms of their perceived competence, their perceived hireability, and they were asked what would the starting salary for this person be, and whether or not the student was worthy of mentoring. And the only difference in the CVs, they were identical with the exception of the name at the top. It was either John or Jennifer. And what you can see is that the male student was considered substantially more competent than the female candidate. The male was substantially more hireable than the female. And in fact, the starting salary for Jennifer was about 85 cents on the dollar compared to John. And the male student was more deserving of mentoring, which is atrocious, right? So we know that bias exists. This is a relatively small study, but there have been so many other studies, really large ones, small ones, controlled ones, correlational ones. What's really interesting about this study, and was news to me, is that faculty members' bias was independent of their gender. Women discriminate against women, same as men, because we all have these biases, because we've all been participating in a society that doesn't value women or racialized people or people with disabilities or people from the LGBT and GQ+ communities. Yeah. So faculty members' bias was independent of gender, scientific discipline, age, and tenure status. And this is also really important because we tend to say things like, oh, it's better in the younger generation. The younger generation is going to save us. They're not. We have to do things differently if we actually want those numbers to change, if we want those numbers to actually reflect the richness of society. So this is another example of a fabulous study, which I just left here in case you want to check it out. To show you that things really haven't changed, this was an updated version of this study that was published in 2019. And they do essentially the exact same thing, but instead of just looking at gender, they also look at race. So we've got male, female, white, Chinese, Black, and Latinx names on this study. And up at the top, we've got biology, down at the bottom, we've got physics, and we're looking at perceived competence here. So what you can see is, for the most part, across different ethnic groups, men are still considered more competent than women, and substantially more competent in a way that actually makes a difference. But there is substantial variability between groups, right? So actually, when you look at Asian men, they are considered just as competent as white men, whereas Black men considerably less competent. Now, it's important to remember when looking at this study that perception of competence does not necessarily mean that this particular group doesn't experience discrimination, right? They can experience discrimination in other ways. It really depends on what we're looking at. Right here, we're looking at competence. So there's substantial variability between the genders and between the sexes, but this variability leads to, or the differences in how people perceive others leads to important discrimination that has caused the situation that we now find ourselves in. So we know we have a problem. We know that it's caused by all of us. We all act in a way, we all participate in society in a way that perpetuates bias and discrimination. Even if we don't, we say, no, I don't want to participate. By saying you're not participating, you are reinforcing those status quos. So I really do think that it is important that we all act. If we don't act, we are not going to see any change. And so what I have here is a number of different points that you can go into and look at and pull from to try to act in a way that will start to actually make a difference for people. So these all come from a publication in ACS Central Science. It's freely available, so you can download it at your leisure. So step one is to acknowledge your personal biases and recognize your privilege, right? Every one of us is biased. Every one of us. Doesn't matter where you come from. Where you come from might influence your biases. They might be different than mine, but all of us are biased. And it matters because we act on those biases. Also, all of us have privilege. And so for example, we can all work in English, which is a privilege. English is a hard language to learn. I've tried learning other languages, and I am so privileged to have English as a first language, and I really commend people who struggle with it, who are learning it as a second language, because it's hard. They're amazing. But we have the ability to work in English is a privilege. The ability to take time to come to a talk like this is a privilege. We all have privilege. And with privilege, so this is important because with privilege comes power. We have the ability to make a difference, every one of us, even if that difference is just within our circle of friends and family, as opposed to, you know, a national scale. That power means that you can make a difference. So that's step one, is to acknowledge your place in this, this system, the society that we have. Number two is to do your research, listen to your friends and colleagues, and then be vocal. So it's about understanding the issues and what you can do about them. You can't actually address discrimination and bias unless you understand something about it. What does it look like? How does it manifest? And the way to do that, I'm not going to go through these are just examples of how it can manifest. But the way to do that is to, you know, engage with it. There are books, movies, you know, Michelle Obama's Becoming, for example, Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be Anti-Racist, just as an example. There's so much that's written. You know, if you like podcasts, Jessica Vandenberg's Unsettled is a fabulous podcast about truth and reconciliation. So there's lots of things that you can look up. It's really important to start to engage, to understand what's happening. Listen to your friends and colleagues, especially if they come from a marginalized group. You know, I'm sorry to hear that happened. I'm here if you need to talk. Listen without judgment. Listen without gaslighting or rationalizing or saying, oh, maybe it wasn't that bad. Just listening has a really profound effect on somebody's valuing themselves. And then be vocal. We are never going to change the system if we don't act, if we don't say something. And being vocal is a skill. I've got a separate talk on allyship. And one of the most important things is that being vocal is a skill that you learn. It is not something that you're born knowing how to do. And like any skill, you know, ice skating, whatever, you get better when you practice it. So being vocal is absolutely key. And there are lots of different things you can say. On my website, I have a section that's called Curated EDI Resources. And there's a thing in there that talks about conversation starters or sentence starters to address when something has been said. It's called Calling In versus Calling Out, and it's a really good resource. Number three is being strategic about who you work with. So if you are a trainee right now, and you may or may not have a lot of influences in the hiring, that's fine. But you want to be strategic about the lab that you find yourself working in, or the next institution that you find yourself working in, because you want to work with people who value you for who you are, for people who will write that fabulous reference letter going forward. There are lots of things that you can do as the person doing the hiring. And I'm not going to go through them. Again, these are just a resource. A lot of these are in the review, but also feel free to take a picture of that. So lots of things that you can do from the hiring side, but also things that you want to think about going into a new lab. It is perfectly okay to ask the department that you're going to or the lab that you're going to what their understanding of EDI is. I ask it of all of the trainees, even the undergrads who are potentially coming into my lab. And I did ask it when I was interviewing for my position as assistant professor. So it is okay to do that. Number 4 is to restructure hiring, retention, and advancement programs. I'm not going to go through that too much. What I do want to say, though, is that there is a lot of information that is associated with graduate school and being a postdoc and being a faculty member or a staff scientist or whatever that is invisible. It's information that you need to do your job well, but is either buried in a website somewhere or difficult to find. And it makes doing your job more difficult than it would be if you had that information. But what happens is that when you're in a group of people, like your colleagues, and you are part of the dominant group, the in group, you tend to have access to that information because you talk to people who know where that information can be found, or who tell you that you need to know that information, tell you you should be looking out for opportunities coming forward, that kind of thing. So people who are part of the in group, the dominant group, have access to this invisible information that people who are part of the out group, who are frequently marginalized, don't have. And so one of the things that I did when I was a graduate student was to create the Graduate Student Survival Guide, which was an attempt to put all of this insider information into a document to be given to other graduate students that would help those who don't necessarily have access to that in-group actually navigate grad school productively. So just a thought there, but don't have to follow in my shoes. Be creative. There are lots of things that you can do. Number 5 is to generate a code of conduct as a team. So a code of conduct is a living document that is a set of shared ideals for how you want to interact with one another. When you interact with people from diverse backgrounds, they have different perspectives, they have different societal expectations. For example, if you think about interrupting, so if you think about when you're having a conversation with somebody, do you interrupt them before they've finished talking? Do you, like when you value somebody, do you interrupt them? Some people do because that's how you keep the conversation going. That's just showing that they're engaged. And some people don't because interrupting can be considered rude, right? That is very cultural. That is really heavily influenced by where in the world you come from, by your background. But what one person could think of as, yes, this is absolutely wonderful, they're clearly listening to me, to another person is, wow, they didn't hear a word I just said, they were waiting to jump in on their own. So the code of conduct is about formalizing that, getting it out in the open and talking about our shared values and how we want to interact with one another. 6 is to be inclusive. So it is telling people, like being verbal about, you are a valued member of this team. How can I modify this activity so that you feel comfortable participating? It is not the same thing as rescuing someone or, saying, oh, well, we can't do that activity because so-and-so wouldn't like it. It's about bringing people into the conversation and saying, we want to do an event that achieves X goal. How can we do that to best be inclusive? So that's being inclusive, being intentional. This is number 2 of the 3 I's: inclusive, intentional. Intentional is recognizing that there are bottlenecks, there are stopping points, there are these, we call it the glass obstacle course, right? As opposed to the leaky pipeline. The leak from the pipeline is passive. And the glass obstacle course, we're all running through it, but people from marginalized groups get held back because they run into these barriers. Being intentional is about recognizing that these barriers exist for different people and taking the steps necessary to mitigate them. So I'll give you an example. When I was in my postdoc, I worked in a really male-dominated lab. I was the only female on an entirely male team. And the guys would go out for a drink to be social afterwards because they were friends in addition to being colleagues. There's nothing wrong with being friends with your colleagues. But while they were out being friends, they were engaging in conversation that was like, oh, we should write a review together. Yeah, we should include these topics, these references. So now while they're doing this friendly thing, they're coming up with ideas for work, things that will enhance their career. And because I was not a part of the social group, I was left out of the work opportunities. And so ways to mitigate that as a supervisor, for example, is when those two guys come into your office to say, well, we're going to write this review, you say things like, this is great, but I think you should include Jasmine because she's got expertise in this area as well, right? So that's being intentional. Oh, I changed this. It used to be an I. I had 3 I's and then I changed it. And now number 8 is be supportive. I was excited about the 3 I's, but it just didn't work. Okay, so being supportive is about being emotionally supportive. So people from marginalized groups get told all the time they don't belong, they're not smart enough. And when you hear that over and over again, you start to internalize it, you start to believe it. And that's a problem because it's not true. So being supportive is about saying things like, I really value your creativity and participation. I mean, maybe we can't do your idea, but thank you for throwing that idea out there. It's really important for your learning. It's really important for my understanding, and please keep doing it. That is being supportive. Specifically with regards to graduate school, graduate school is competitive. Academia is competitive. And we're our own worst enemies sometimes, especially when you're from a marginalized group. We tend to idolize these lone geniuses in science, right? Like Einstein, for example, is a lone genius. He was born smart, and that's why he was successful. But in actual fact, social belonging and growth mindsets. So the idea that, okay, you may not be great at this now, but you will get better. That can be really, really helpful for people who are in academia. It's been shown to improve academic achievement and increase program completion, which is absolutely amazing. So writing is one of these things, for example, that most graduate students struggle with. And it makes them feel like idiots when they have to write, the introduction to a paper or try to write a discussion. And talking people through it and saying, I know it's frustrating, but I also know that you are going to get better. So let's focus on, how do we do this? Let's work out some skills that you can work on to improve, to get better. So that is being supportive. Number 9, we're almost there, is rethinking the status quo, right? We have been doing things for a very long time in a way that has historical origins in wealth and in power, right? So if you think about who was doing science, it was mostly the wealthy who did not have to do like farming or working in factories or things like that, right? Because they actually had time to do science, which was often not paid work. When in Northern Europe, Northwestern Europe. And we've been doing research that benefits that demographic because that's what they're interested in. And it does not work for everyone. The system of doing science does not work for everyone. The way that we do science, the emphasis that we place on certain things. Why do we care about things like H-index? Why do we care about things like impact factors when we know there are so many problems with impact factors? We know that men tend to cite themselves and each other more than women do. So we know that there's a problem with it. Why do we still value it the way that we value it? Why, at a graduate school level, do we value past awards? We know that those are based on where you came from and your opportunities. We know that they're problematic. Why do we still value them? And so this is about rethinking what we value. We've always done it this way is not working. It does not work for everybody. We need to change how we do things. And the last one is to make action a habit. So there's lots of data that shows that attending a seminar like this could be enough to change behavior for about 24 to 48 hours. It's not enough just to come to something like this to actually generate any kind of long-lasting change. We need to engage with EDI on a regular basis. So making action a habit, revisiting the code of conduct, looking up some make it a challenge for yourself. Once a week, I'm going to do something to do with EDI. I'm going to read a chapter in a book. I'm going to watch a movie. I'm going to listen to a podcast once a week. You can read or discuss EDI papers in Journal Club, right? We talk about our own science in Journal Club. Twice a year, I actually use my Journal Club to talk about the literature about EDI because there's lots of it. It's a really cool scientific field. Partake in seminars like this as a group and then debrief afterwards. What about that works for us? What could we do? That was inspiring. I've got ideas now. Or maybe this doesn't work for you. But having a discussion as a group. Valuing EDI, creating awards, even if they're not financial, is a big deal. Actually valuing the people who are doing the work is, I think, critical. So the key thoughts to end are to start small. The magnitude of the problem is overwhelming. The problem is pervasive. It is everywhere. It's in everything that we do. And it can feel like it's hard to make a difference as a person, but there's really good evidence that it actually, small changes can make a huge difference. And I have the studies if you're interested in them. I'll give you one example. A university in the US sent letters to half of the incoming undergraduate population before they had even got to campus, right? This is in the summer after grade 12. Half of the incoming students received a letter. And the letter was written from a senior student who said, if you're marginalized, university can feel really isolating. It can feel like you don't belong. It can feel like you're not smart enough. I felt that way, but don't worry, you belong here. Everyone has a right to the opportunity to do science. And here are a couple of things that I did that helped me. I joined a student group, for example. It helped me find community when I was feeling isolated. That letter was enough to increase the probability of those students who received it completing their program 4 years later by 30%, which is huge. It's just a letter. So really, really small things can have really profound impacts, long-lasting, profound impacts. So start small. Be ready to feel uncomfortable, especially as you work through things that, your biases, acknowledging that you are part of the problem. I can tell you it's hard. It's absolutely hard. It's an ongoing process. Sometimes be ready to feel uncomfortable, and then reward yourself for working through difficult subject areas. These are hard. This is hard. It's hard stuff. Otherwise, it would be fixed. And then track your progress. Hold yourself accountable. Hold your peer group accountable as you work through this, so that you know that you are making progress. So with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention. I am really happy to answer any questions and looking forward to chatting. Thank you very much.